Hello, this is Ollie, the developer of DrawingBotV3. In this video, I'm going to go over the new pathfinding module, Sketch Sweeping Curves. This is actually me after I recorded this. I ended up going into detail about all of the individual settings here. So if you just want to see it in action, don't feel like you need to stay around for all of that. But if you are interested, I kind of ramble on about all of the different settings. And there might be a few interesting little bits of detail for you in there. So this is an evolution of some of the other curve pathfinding modules. You might be familiar with quad beziers, cubic beziers, Catmull ROMs, and sketch curves. So to break down these other ones to compare to sweeping curves, sketch curves is really basic curves that are, it's not really checking if it's the best curve fit. It's using lines to simplify, which is why sketch curves runs very quickly. And it has some nice curves in here. But you can see they change direction quite a lot, and they're a bit rough. So if you want a rougher curve drawing, sketch curves is the way to go. Quad beziers is made up of loads of connected curves, which are using just 3 points. So it's a curve going in one direction and then a middle point which we have control over. So that middle point we can control the variation and the offset and things like that. Again, it's more of a messy style, and the same goes for cubic beziers and Catmull ROMs. They're messier styles, whereas sketch sweeping curves, the emphasis is all on drawing really long curves and curves which follow the natural direction of the image, and also curves that don't turn too quickly, that always maintain this kind of sweeping feeling. And what's good about these is that it's going to reduce your plotting time. There's less actual shapes and vertices, but also it looks more organic and natural. And when you zoom in, you get all these really beautiful combinations of shapes. And you can also see with this example, if I go to the image, you can see it's got this one line coming down here, and if we go to the drawing, we can see that the curves have followed it almost perfectly, which is much more similar to what you would do if you were drawing this by hand. You would trace along or sketch along the edge of this sphere, and this is why I think this pathfinding module is going to be a really interesting one for people to play with, because I think this is more likely to potentially trick people into thinking this could have been done by hand. Not that we want to trick people, but it is part of what's fascinating about pen plotting, is that this is done by machines. This is a good result straight away. This is a good choice of image, I would say, as well, because it's got a lot of white areas and it's got good contrast, which is why I chose it, because I think it really shows what is good about sweeping curves. So I think a lot of these settings will be familiar to people if you've used Sketch PFMs before, but I feel like I'll go through them a little bit anyway. So we can turn on should lift pen, turn off should lift pen, and now this image is going to be one continuous line. So all of these curves are going to be connected. You're not going to need all these pen lifts, and it'll be quicker to plot again. We'll just let it finish. So there we go, there's an example with one continuous line. We've got directionality, so this forces the curves to follow the natural contours of the image more. So if we increase the directionality, we might end up with a bit more of a messy drawing, because the lines are being forced in one direction or another. So it's very stylized. The main thing you can see here is how emphasized these lines cutting through. So on the original image, these curves are really going to be represented quite strongly when you have a high directionality, but also because we've got directionality at the absolute maximum, we're getting a bit of mess as well, because what's actually happening is all of these style parameters here are basically, they're fighting for control. So if I have directionality at 100 and luminance power at 100, so the darkness and brightness of the image is what normally drives where the curves end up. But here now I've got directionality and luminance power at the same power, which means that sometimes it'll ignore the fact that this area is actually white, and it will just draw there anyway because it will have a strong directional idea here, because this is in white areas. So that's something to bear in mind. So if we in fact decrease the directionality, we can get a similar effect where it follows the contours, but it doesn't draw so much on the white areas. So you can see here we're now getting the same emphasis on these lines, but we're not getting it drawing all over the place. So I think with sweeping curves, a directionality between 0 and 25 I found seems to be a good place to be. And you can see here the curves are really kind of bending around more than they were before, and we're getting an even clearer representation of the shapes in the image. Next, we've got clarity. If you increase the clarity, you're going to get a lot more detail retained. So now this is finished, you can see again we've got even more like smaller details being kept now as well. And if we zoom out, the sharpness of the overall image is just a lot stronger. Next we've got distortion. This essentially adds some noise to the lines, so if we increase this massively, you can see the curves are a lot more messy now. So it can just add a bit more of a human touch to it, because but a high distortion as well, you can see it's also drawing on the white areas again, which I think for this image we don't want. But within these other areas, the distortion is helping it quite a bit to just look that little bit more natural. But I think for this example, I'm actually going to drop it down. Angularity introduces some more sharper angles, and it forces the line to keep continuing in certain ways. So high angularity, we're basically forcing it to continue going the way the first line started, and it can end up with these almost embossed, like three-dimensional effects. It's a really stylized way, so you see like once it starts on this angle here, it does force it to continue that way. So it really does emphasize the angles even more. If I stop that, but this is probably a bit too high really. If we use a lower angularity, we're basically saying keep going in a similar direction more, but it does kind of force its hand a bit more than you would like. So you know, here it would have probably made sense for it to bend around, but with a high angularity it was forced to continue going upwards essentially. So you end up with things like this, where it's being the line is coming down this way and it has to continue going this way. But it's again, this is more for making a bit more of a stylized thing. There's some interesting shapes going on with a lower angularity here, but I'm going to leave it at 0. Edge power, this is basically introducing some more edge detection and forcing the lines to follow the edges. So if I increase this to 100, you can already see down here like it's really emphasizing the edges there around the bottom of the base and again along the side, so it's bringing in even more detail again. And there is some overlap between clarity, edge power and directionality. They're kind of all towards similar aims, but edge power in particular is going to emphasize the like outer edges of things. So if it's yeah, for example, where it's white on black, edge power is going to really force the curves to keep within this edge, or along the edge I should say. Again, these are things that you can just tweak until you find something you like, but we're getting quite a lot of detail in here. Sobel power is basically again similar to edge power, but it's using a Sobel filter, which is another type of edge detection. It results in a bit more of a cartoony effect, so you can see it's emphasizing the edges of this again more so than the others, and we're getting a bit more of a cartoony look to it already. So if we stop this now, you can see this is much more like graphic novel-y or cartoony thanks to the Sobel filter, or the Sobel power being high. Just to increase the processing time a little bit, I will drop this to A4 paper. So let's stop it and start it again. Okay, next we're going to look at the segments section. This is where you control how long the individual lines are and how many lines are being drawn. Line density is effectively controlling how many curves we want to draw in this example. So if we decrease it massively, we're going to only draw a certain amount of lines and then it'll stop. So it's a much simpler drawing. If we increase it, we're going to get a few more. If we go a bit higher, go to say 87, and I'm just going to let this run. So now you see we've probably gone beyond the amount of lines we actually want to draw if we don't want all of these other ones up going all over the place over the white areas. But we can actually kind of control the line density after we've finished drawing, or at least we can decrease the line density simply by dragging the shape slider. This is essentially doing exactly the same thing as line density. Line density is basically just saying when you reach this point, stop, but we can drag back from the end point and find where we want to be. So with around there is looking quite good, and you can see with this box apply to export enabled, this is going to affect anything we export, so we're only going to get these lines even though we allowed it to draw many more. Mid-length and max length are quite self-explanatory. I'm going to decrease the density for this, and if we increase our max line length to say 200, you can see we're getting these even longer sweeping curves. We could also decrease our minimum line length. We could go all the way down to say 4 or something, and then you'll see detailed areas of the image that the curves are really quite small and detailed, essentially in here as well. You can see there are some smaller curves, but obviously it's still choosing between 4 and 200. If you really want shorter curves, you should lower both of these values, and then we're getting much shorter curves. But I think this doesn't really emphasize what's nice about this Pathfinder module is you kind of lose the effect of them really sweeping, but it's still quite a cool style, and this way you really do maintain a lot of detail from the original. I find for this Pathfinder module, like between 10, 20 for the minimum, and like maybe 40 even, and then between like 80 and 120 is a good place for the max line length. So the next one, line max limit, this is just placing a limit on how many actual curves you want it to draw. So 42,000 here. I don't think we're going to reach that point. Let's put in 1,000, let it run. There you go, we've got exactly 1,000 shapes. So this is quite cool for maybe like video processing. You could limit how many and create some. I mean, even like this, like the subtlety of this, I don't know, it's kind of interesting. You might be able to make something with this, but it's still the same as basically putting a really low line density, but you can just actually put a number on it. Next, we've got squiggles. So if we actually turn off should lift pen, the squiggles are basically having no impact really, because the pen is never being lifted. But if the pen is being lifted, swiggle min and max basically says let's draw 25 curves before we potentially lift up the pen. We need to draw at least 25, and the maximum, when we hit 500, let's lift up the pen wherever it is. So you could, for example, with this example, you could increase the max length a lot, and just say if the curves are going to work, let's not lift the pen, let's keep going. The benefit of having a lower max length is the accuracy of the final image, but if you can increase the max length more and it doesn't seem to ruin the image, I think what it's introduced here is these kind of other curves on the outside. Again, if you can increase it, you're going to decrease your plotting time. So the squiggle max deviation, this is controlling how different the curve can be from the original image before it says, okay, no, that's too different, I'm going to stop and start a new squiggle now. So if we put this really, really low, you're going to see it's going to kind of jump around more and start from different places. It's possibly hard to see with this pathfinding module, but on like sketch lines, for example, you'll really be able to see what a low deviation can do. So those are the squiggle settings. Next we've got curvature. So this, if we increase this, we're going to get even more curvy sweeping curves. Although 0.5 is in general actually still better, because at this value you can actually get knots in the curves. They're hard to create, but it is more possible, whereas at 0.5 it's kind of a good middle ground. And then if you go to 0, this is going to be straighter curves. You can see like here, like it comes to a point that kind of goes back a bit more sharply, whereas if we go 100% curvature, you'll see you don't get that so much. It's very subtle, but 0.5 is the best, I find. So I generally keep it at that. Then it's got erasing controls. This is controlling how many times to draw over an area of the image before we say we've drawn enough. So if you run a plot and then you discover that it's too dark and you've drawn over the same area too many times, then you need to increase your erase settings because your pen is probably too dark. So we could maybe go to 75 and maybe 150 on the maximum, and this will reduce the number of lines that are being drawn and the amount of times they draw over each other. We can also change the radius of the erasing. To see what this actually is doing, when it's finished processing, you can go to the lightened tab, and this is basically what DrawingBot was using to process the image. So when a line is drawn, it is brightening that area of the image. If we increase the radius, it's going to have a bigger effect. So if we put it to 4, we can see the lines are already more spread out. If we go to the lightened, you can see it's using, in some areas it's using thicker lines to represent the erased part of the image. So this is like, again, to control the overlap and to control the style, because you basically are spreading out the curves a bit more. The tone is the final one. If you increase it massively, you're going to still try and exaggerate the darker areas more, and if you decrease it, it's going to be much looser and it's not going to exaggerate the dark areas. It's kind of going to just draw the whole area with the same kind of emphasis. So the tone actually is controlling the mapping between the minimum and the maximum variables of these. So essentially with a higher tone, more of the darker areas will be drawn with the minimum or closer to the minimum, and with a lower tone it will just be linear between the two values. So again, the default's 50, which just means that darker areas will still be emphasized a little bit. Okay, so that was probably just a lot of information. I hope that was kind of useful. So that is kind of sketch sweeping curves. It creates, these really cool kind of abstract looking curves. I'm going to reset it back to the default. Okay, so now we're back to our default settings. Like any of the other sketch pathfinding modules, we can control all of our pens and everything. We can have loads of different combinations of pens, and all of them work really well with the sketch sweeping curves. We can also run it with CMYK, so we can go into color separation, select CMYK, let's hit apply. We need to run it one more time. And this is quite a cool representation of it with the CMYK colors. I think this will probably look a bit better. I think it needs a bit more detail, so we could drop the line length a little bit, and we could increase the clarity to maybe 50. We might increase the edge power to 50 as well. Let's see if we can get just a bit more detail. this is quite a cool looking style. So I hope that was useful and you learnt something from my ramblings. In the next video we're going to look at doing some cool inverted styles which are on black paper, which are a lot of fun. So make sure you check that one out next.